she said. "Alone, dear?" "Yes, aunt. I've got a lot of things to think about." Miss Stanley reflected as Ann Veronica went toward the house. She thought her niece very hard and very self-possessed and self-confident. She ought to be softened and tender and confidential at this phase of her life. She seemed to have no idea whatever of the emotional states that were becoming to her age and position. Miss Stanley walked round the garden thinking, and presently house and garden reverberated to Ann Veronica's slamming of the front door. "I wonder," said Miss Stanley. For a long time she surveyed a row of towering hollyhocks as though they offered an explanation. Then she went in and upstairs, hesitated on the landing, and finally, a little breathless and with an air of great dignity, opened the door and walked into Ann Veronica's room. It was a neat, efficient-looking room, with a writing-table placed with a business-like regard to the window, and a bookcase surmounted by a pig's skull, a dissected frog in a sealed bottle, and a pile of shiny, black-covered note-books. In the corner of the room were 2 hockey sticks and a tennis racket, and upon the walls Ann Veronica, by means of autotypes, had indicated her proclivities in art. But Miss Stanley took no notice of these things. She walked straight across to the wardrobe and opened it. There, hanging among Ann Veronica's more normal clothing, was a skimpy dress of red canvas, trimmed with cheap and tawdry braid, and short. It could hardly reach below the knee. On the same peg, and evidently belonging to it, was a black velvet Zouave jacket. And then a garment that was conceivably a secondary skirt. Miss Stanley hesitated, and took first one and then another of the constituents of this costume off its peg and surveyed it. The third item she took with a trembling hand by its waist-belt. As she raised it, its lower portion fell apart into 2 baggy crimson masses. "Trousers!" she whispered. Her eyes travelled about the room as if in appeal to the very chairs. Tucked under the writing-table, a pair of yellow and gold Turkish slippers of a highly meretricious quality caught her eye. She walked over to them still carrying the trousers in her hands, and stooped to examine them. They were ingenious disguises of gilt paper destructively gummed, it would seem, to Ann Veronica's best dancing slippers. Then she reverted to the trousers. "How can I tell him?" whispered Miss Stanley. Part 2. Ann Veronica carried a light but businesslike walking-stick. She walked with an easy quickness down the avenue and through the proletarian portion of Morningside Park, and crossing these fields came into a pretty overhung lane that led toward Caddington and the Downs. And then her pace slackened. She tucked her stick under her arm and re-read Manning's letter. "Let me think," said Ann Veronica. "I wish this hadn't turned up to-day of all days." She found it difficult to begin thinking, and indeed she was anything but clear what it was she had to think about. Practically it was most of the chief interests in life that she proposed to settle in this pedestrian meditation. Primarily it was her own problem, and in particular the answer she had to give to Mr. Manning's letter. But in order to get data for that she found that she, having a logical and ordered mind, had to decide upon the general relations of men to women, the objects and conditions of marriage, and its bearing upon the welfare of the race, the purpose of the race, the purpose, if any, of everything. "Frightful lot of things aren't settled," said Ann Veronica. In addition, the fad and dance business, all out of proportion, occupied the whole foreground of her thoughts and threw a color of rebellion over everything. She kept thinking she was thinking about Mr. Manning's proposal of marriage, and finding she was thinking of the dance. For a time her efforts to achieve a comprehensive concentration were dispersed by the passage of the village street of Caddington, the passing of a goggled carload of motorists, and the struggles of a stable lad mounted on one recalcitrant horse and leading another. When she got back to her questions again in the monotonous high road that led up the hill, she found the image of Mr. Manning central in her mind. He stood there large and dark, enunciating in his clear voice from beneath his large moustache clear flat sentences, deliberately kindly. He proposed. He wanted to possess her. He loved her. Ann Veronica felt no repulsion at the prospect. That Mr. Manning loved her presented itself to her bloodlessly, stilled from any imaginative quiver or thrill of passion or disgust. The relationship seemed to have almost as much to do with blood and body as a mortgage. It was something that would create a mutual claim, a relationship. It was in another world from that in which men will die for a kiss, and touching hands lights fires that burn up lives, the world of romance, the world of passionately beautiful things. But that other world, in spite of her resolute exclusion of it, was always looking round corners and peeping through chinks and crannies, and rustling and raiding into the order in which she chose to live, shining out of pictures at her, echoing in lyrics and music. It invaded her dreams. It wrote up broken and enigmatical sentences upon the passage walls of her mind. She was aware of it now as if it were a voice shouting outside a house, shouting passionate verities in a hot sunlight, a voice that cries while people talk insincerely in a darkened room and pretend not to hear. Its shouting now did in some occult manner convey a protest that Mr. Manning would on no account do, though he was tall and dark and handsome and kind, and 35 and adequately prosperous, and all that a husband should be. But there was, it insisted, no mobility in his face, no movement, nothing about him that warmed. If Ann Veronica could have put words to that song, they would have been "Hot-blooded marriage or none." But she was far too indistinct in this matter to frame any words at all. "I don't love him," said Ann Veronica, getting a gleam. "I don't see that his being a good sort matters. That really settles about that. But it means no end of a row." For a time she sat on a rail before leaving the road for the downland turf. "But I wish," she said, "I had some idea what I was really up to." Her thoughts went into solution for a time while she listened to a lark singing. "Marriage and mothering," said Ann Veronica, with her mind crystallizing out again as the lark dropped to the nest in the turf. "And all the rest of it perhaps is a song." Part 3. Her mind got back to the Fadden Ball. She meant to go, she meant to go, she meant to go. Nothing would stop her, and she was prepared to face the consequences. Suppose the father turned her out of doors? She did not care, she meant to go. She would just walk out of the house and go. She thought of her costume in some detail and with considerable satisfaction, and particularly of a very jolly property dagger with large glass jewels in the handle that reposed in a drawer in her room. She was to be a corsair's bride. Fancy stabbing a man for jealousy, she thought. You'd have to think how to get in between his bones. She thought of her father, and with an effort dismissed him from her mind. She tried to imagine the collective effect of the Fadden Ball. She had never seen a fancy dress gathering in her life. Mr. Manning came into her thoughts again, an unexpected, tall, dark, self-contained presence at the Fadden. One might suppose him turning up. He knew a lot of clever people, and some of them might belong to the class. What would he come as? Presently she roused herself with a guilty start from the task of dressing and redressing Mr. Manning in fancy costume, as though he was a doll. She had tried him as a crusader, in which guise he seemed plausible but heavy. There is something heavy about him. I wonder if it's his moustache. And as a hussar, which made him preposterous, and as a Black Brunswicker, which was better, and as an Arab sheik. Also she had tried him as a dragoman and as a gendarme, which seemed the most suitable of all to his severely handsome, immobile profile. She felt he would tell people the way, control traffic, and refuse admission to public buildings with invincible correctness and the very finest explicit feelings possible. For each costume she had devised a suitable form of matrimonial refusal. "Oh, Lord!" she said, discovering what she was up to, and dropped lightly from the fence upon the turf and went on her way toward the crest. "I shall never marry," said Ann Veronica resolutely. "I'm not the sort. That's why it's so important I should take my own line now." Part 4. Ann Veronica's ideas of marriage were limited and unsystematic. Her teachers and mistresses had done their best to stamp her mind with an ineradicable persuasion that it was tremendously important, and on no account to be thought about. Her first intimations of marriage as a fact of extreme significance in a woman's life had come with the